Your last trip took us to the edges of Kharkiv, where the battles were particularly intense at the time. Tell us what it was like.
It was incredibly intense. You know, since the early stages of the war, Russian forces had been pounding Kharkiv, really hitting the city centre. I know you went there yourself as well, Nadia. We're multitasking as the watchword here on France 24. But in March and April, those bombs were still hitting the northern, the eastern outskirts of the city day and night, very hard, often in civilian areas, and there were lots of losses every single day, at least 3 or 4 funerals a day taking place in each of the cemeteries in the city that we visited. And the damage to the city centre, the infrastructure is huge, and people had really lived through an awful period, mainly living underground, those who hadn't fled Kharkiv, and lots of them, thousands of them, were still sleeping in the metro. And we took several reporting trips to a suburb in the northern outskirts of Kharkiv, these housing blocks in Saltivka, the Saltivka neighbourhood, which had been coming under incessant shelling. Most people had fled, but some people had remained, and they were often among the most vulnerable people. So elderly people, ill people, people with no family who didn't know where to go or felt that they'd be lost if they left, or some of them couldn't move. And so you had these burnt out, bombed out buildings which were still inhabited, and it was heartbreaking to see. And I want to play an extract of a report that we filmed which really moved us as reporters, but also a lot of viewers and colleagues and people got in touch to say that this had really shaken them, to show this human face of the cost of this battle for Kharkiv. So we can watch an extract of this report we filmed in Saltivka now.
War has reduced these streets to a wasteland. The neighbourhood of Saltivka, on the northern edge of Kharkiv, whose housing estates have been blasted by Russian shelling. All but a handful of residents have fled. Ludmila is 75 years old and only one of 5 left in her block. She's relieved to find some company. On the 23rd of March, her building was hit.
Тоже наши едут с подъезда. Спасибо вам большое. Как страшно вы в такое время, такие обстрелы. Ночью сегодня очень было страшно. И сегодня целый день.
This family has fled the bombing to sleep elsewhere, but they still bring food out of solidarity.
Приезжаем каждый день, с соседями здороваемся и уезжаем обратно вечером. Помогаем, что-то привозим, что-то не привозим. И уезжаем обратно.
Every day and night here is punctuated now by the sound of explosions as artillery pounds the outskirts of Ukraine's second largest city. At least 300 people have been killed here under fire.
And Catherine, when you filmed there in Kharkiv, clearly the bombardment's really intense. Just give us an update. The woman we saw there, Ludmila, do we know how she's doing now?
Yeah, I have got an update from a local producer we were working with on the ground, and she's still there. She's still okay. Clearly she's been shaken up by the bombing of her neighbourhood for months, but she's unharmed physically. And she was such a kind lady. She, down in the bomb shelter, was trying to give us food and drink, and we were saying, you know, you must keep your supplies. But she's still there, and there's much less bombing on that neighbourhood now because, as we know, Russian forces have been driven back further out of Kharkiv, to the Russian border in some places.
Well, that, I suppose, a little bit of good news, Catherine, but you were there at the very start of the war, in fact, actually before the Russian invasion began. And just tell us what that was like. How did Ukrainian people react to the start of this conflict?
It was incredible, really, to see the psychological journey that a lot of Ukrainians we met made. So right before the war, on the eve of the war, we were down in the city of Mariupol. And we were asking people there, you know, do you think there's going to be an invasion? How do you think it's going to impact your city? And even there, even in Mariupol, people were saying to us that they didn't quite believe it, some of them, or they didn't think clearly that it was going to have the scale that it did. That city devastated. I'm sure many of the people we interviewed have fled or are injured or are dead. So it's incredibly sad. And some of them saying they'd made provisions, but not all of them. Some of them were at the ice rink the night before the invasion in town, in the city centre. And we said to them, have you got stocks of food? Have you got your cellar ready? And a lot of them said that they just thought this was hype, that it was being stirred up in the media, that it wasn't really real. Which is terrifying to think that they didn't have enough stocks of food, given clearly what came next. And then there was a huge period, I would say, of shock and disbelief. We saw a lot of shaken up people, and very quickly a lot of people being galvanised. We saw frantic activity of volunteers literally running around. I remember in the city of Dnipro, of people just literally sprinting, bringing supplies backwards and forwards in this really urgent war effort, and a huge amount of national pride among a lot of Ukrainians who, even some of them, hadn't felt that before.
Catherine Norris-Trent, our senior reporter